Forward TV. The world is thinking.
My experience has been that almost anybody can come to a better understanding of this if you hit them where they're at, if you hit them on what matters to them. I know that we don't win this thing unless we persuade every or the majority, great majority of American parents that they have more to gain and their children are going to be safer in a world in which the criminal justice system plays a less and less and more reduced role in dealing with drugs in our society. I know that when I'm speaking with African American communities, what's important to bring home there? Of course, they get it about crack powder and the injustice of the racial disparities and the disproportionality of the arrests and the persecution and prosecution of young black, brown, and men and the problems with, not just driving while black, but walking while black or even running while black, God forbid, right? I mean, I know that that's a part of it. But when some come back and say, well, I just want the laws to be enforced equally, no, that's not sufficient. That's not sufficient. And we should not, and they cannot, we cannot accept the notion that somehow there's an underlying legitimacy to these laws in the first place. I mean, somehow we tend to think that back 50, 100 years ago, that some independent commissions were established that concluded that well, these drugs should be legal and these drugs should be illegal. Alcohol and cigarettes, yeah, we had the experience with alcohol prohibition, but yeah, and these ones, well, marijuana, cocaine, heroin, more. What is the fact? If you ask how and why was that distinction made, and when you look carefully at the history, and when you realize the sort of Monty Python nature of the legislative deliberations that led to these criminalizations in the first place 100 years ago, what you realize is that the distinction between which drugs should be legal and which drugs should be illegal had essentially nothing to do with the relative dangers of these drugs, and almost everything to do with who used these drugs and who was perceived to use these drugs. So that when the principal users of opiate drugs in America in the 1870s and 80s were primarily middle-class white women in the South, taking opium in laudanum form, other forms for menopause, aches and pains. There was no aspirin, there was no Motrin, right? People had diarrhea, bad sanitation, opium was great for that. Nobody thought to criminalize grandma or our auntie. But when the Chinese came over, working 100 hours a week on the railroads and in the mines and what have you, going back to their dormitories in the night, smoking up that opium pipe just as they had in the old country, and people started to worry, what would that Chinaman with his opium done do to our precious white women, seducing them and raking them and addicting them? That's when we got the first criminal laws prohibiting the opiates in California and Nevada in the 1870s and 1880s. The first anti-cocaine laws were directed at blacks, at black men, at Negroes working on the docks in the South. And the fear was, what would that black man do when he took that white powder up his nose? What might he do to our precious white women? The first anti-marijuana laws were in the teens and the 20s in the Midwest and the Southwest, directed at Mexican Americans, Mexican migrants coming up, taking the good jobs from the good white people, going back home, smoking up a little of that funny smelling, reefer cigarette. And the fear was, once again, what would those darker-skinned people do to our precious women and children? I mean, quite frankly, even alcohol prohibition was to some extent a conflict between the white Americans and the not-so-white Americans, right? The white Americans who came in the 18th and 19th century from northern and western Europe, and the not-so-white Americans coming from southern Europe and eastern Europe in the late 19th century, early 20th century with their beer and their vino and their Schlivowitz, right? Flooding into the American cities, scaring people with their habits and their noise, right? And in fact, the good white people knew that when we had prohibition, alcohol prohibition, it wouldn't really stop them from drinking. They would still be able to drink. It would inevitably be the case that the enforcement of the laws would be directed at others. When African American church leaders advocated for alcohol prohibition because they perceived the evils of alcohol, and then they got what they wanted in the form of an 18th Amendment prohibiting alcohol, and then when those laws were disproportionately enforced against African American people, people eventually woke up.